The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of the prestigious Sterling corporate tower as Henry Martinez pushed his cleaning cart down the executive hallway. At 72 years old, his weathered hands gripped the handle with the same steady determination that had carried him through decades of service. The gray uniform hung loosely on his thin frame, and his silver hair was always neatly combed despite the humble nature of his work. Henry had been cleaning these same floors for 15 years, ever since he moved to the city to be closer to his daughter Maria and her family. Most people barely noticed him as he went about his duties, mopping floors, emptying trash bins, and maintaining the pristine appearance that Sterling corporate demanded. To the young executives who hurried past him with their expensive suits and important phone calls, he was just part of the building's furniture, invisible and insignificant. The 20th floor housed the offices of Sterling's most successful departments, where ambitious young professionals climbed the corporate ladder with ruthless efficiency. Among them was Jake Morrison, a 28-year-old marketing director who had earned his position through a combination of natural talent and calculated networking. Jake's corner office overlooked the city skyline, and he took pride in the view as much as the status it represented. On this particular Tuesday morning, Jake was running late for an important client presentation. His Italian leather shoes clicked impatiently against the marble as he strode toward the conference room, his mind focused on the multi-million-dollar contract that hung in the balance. As he rounded the corner, he nearly collided with Henry, who was carefully cleaning the decorative glass panels that lined the hallway. "Watch where you're going, old man," Jake snapped, barely slowing his pace. "Some of us have real work to do." Henry stepped aside quietly, offering a polite nod that went unacknowledged. He had grown accustomed to such treatment over the years. The young executives saw him as nothing more than an obstacle in their path to success, a reminder of what they feared becoming if they failed to climb high enough. Sarah Chen, a junior analyst who shared Jake's department, witnessed the exchange from her nearby cubicle. At 25, she was still new enough to the corporate world to feel uncomfortable with the casual cruelty she observed daily. Unlike many of her colleagues, Sarah had been raised to respect her elders, and something about Henry's dignified response to Jake's rudeness struck her as remarkable. Later that morning, during the weekly team meeting, Jake regaled his colleagues with stories of his weekend golf game with potential clients. The conversation naturally drifted to complaints about the building's maintenance staff, with several team members joining in to voice their frustrations about cleaning schedules and perceived inefficiencies. "That old janitor on our floor is getting slower every day," complained Rebecca Walsh, a senior account manager known for her sharp tongue. "Yesterday I had to wait almost 30 seconds for him to move his cart so I could get to the printer. At his age, shouldn't he be in a retirement home somewhere?" The group laughed, and Jake seized the opportunity to demonstrate his wit. "Maybe we should start a collection to buy him a wheelchair. At least then, he'd move faster when he's blocking the hallways." The cruel joke drew more laughter from the assembled team members, each trying to outdo the others with increasingly harsh comments about Henry's age, appearance, and perceived incompetence. Only Sarah remained silent, her discomfort growing with each passing minute. Meanwhile, Henry continued his rounds on the floors below, unaware of the mockery taking place upstairs. He took pride in his work, understanding that his efforts contributed to the professional atmosphere that these ambitious young people relied upon for their success. Every surface he cleaned, every trash bin he emptied, every small maintenance task he performed was done with careful attention to detail. During his lunch break, Henry sat alone in the building's basement cafeteria, a sparse room reserved for maintenance and security staff. He pulled out a simple sandwich his daughter had prepared for him and opened a worn paperback book. Despite his humble circumstances, Henry's eyes held a sharp intelligence that few people bothered to notice. He had always been a reader, and books provided him with companionship during the long, solitary hours of his work. The afternoon brought a visit from Colonel Patricia Winters, a distinguished military officer who served as liaison between Sterling Corporate and several government defense contracts. Colonel Winters carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command, and her presence in the building always generated considerable excitement among the staff members who hoped to impress someone with such obvious authority and connections. As she made her way through the building for her scheduled meetings, Colonel Winters observed the daily interactions between employees with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades evaluating character and leadership potential. She noticed Jake's dismissive treatment of support staff, Rebecca's entitled attitude toward building services, and the general atmosphere of casual disrespect that seemed to permeate the executive floors. During her meeting with Sterling's senior management, Colonel Winters raised concerns about the company culture she had observed during her visits. The way an organization treats its most vulnerable members reflects directly on its character and values, she explained to the assembled executives. In the military, we understand that true leadership means showing respect for every person who contributes to the mission, regardless of their rank or position. The senior managers nodded politely, but Colonel Winters could sense that her message was falling on deaf ears. These corporate leaders were more interested in profit margins and quarterly reports than in the philosophical implications of workplace dynamics. However, her words would prove prophetic in ways that none of them could imagine. As the day wound down, Henry completed his final rounds with the same methodical care he had shown for the past 15 years. He straightened papers on desks, ensured trash bins were properly lined, and checked that all common areas met the high standards expected in such a prestigious building. His work was nearly invisible to most people, but it formed the foundation upon which their professional lives were built. That evening, as Henry prepared to leave the building, he encountered Sarah Chen waiting for the elevator. Unlike most of the other employees, she offered him a genuine smile and held the elevator door open for him. During their brief descent to the ground floor, she asked about his day and listened attentively to his quiet responses about the changing seasons and their effect on the building's maintenance needs. "You know," Sarah said as they reached the lobby, "I've always admired how you keep everything so spotless. It must be a lot of work to maintain a building this size." Henry's weathered face broke into a warm smile. "Thank you, miss. That means more to me than you might realize. It's good to know that someone notices." As they parted ways in the lobby, neither Sarah nor Henry could have predicted the events that would soon unfold. The seeds of change had been planted by Colonel Winters' visit and her pointed observations about corporate culture. The contrast between Sarah's basic human decency and her colleagues' casual cruelty had not gone unnoticed by others in the building. Unknown to everyone at Sterling Corporate, Henry Martinez carried with him secrets that would soon transform the way people viewed both him and themselves. His quiet dignity in the face of daily humiliation, his dedication to work that others considered beneath their notice, and his genuine character would soon be revealed in ways that would shock everyone who thought they knew him. The stage was set for revelations that would challenge every assumption the young executives had made about worth, respect, and the true meaning of service. Henry's story was far from over, and the next chapter would begin to unveil the extraordinary truth hidden behind the humble facade of an elderly janitor who had spent his career being overlooked and underestimated. As night fell over the city, the Sterling corporate tower stood silent and imposing against the darkened sky. Inside its polished hallways and executive offices, the seeds of a profound awakening were beginning to take root, though none of the building's occupants yet realized that their comfortable assumptions about hierarchy and human value were about to be permanently shattered. The morning would bring new challenges and opportunities, but it would also bring the beginning of a reckoning that would forever change how the employees of Sterling Corporate understood the true meaning of respect, service, and the hidden depths that exist within every human being, regardless of their position on society's ladder of success. The following Wednesday morning brought an unusual energy to the Sterling Corporate Tower. News had spread quickly through the building's informal communication network that Colonel Winters would be returning for an extended evaluation of the company's operations. Unlike her previous brief visits, this assessment would involve multiple days of observation and interviews with staff at all levels of the organization. Jake Morrison arrived at the office earlier than usual, determined to make a strong impression on the visiting military officer. He had spent the previous evening researching Colonel Winters' background and had been genuinely surprised by her extensive list of accomplishments. Her distinguished military career included multiple tours of duty, several commendations for exceptional service, and a reputation for identifying and developing leadership talent in challenging environments. As Jake prepared for what he hoped would be a career-defining interaction, Henry Martinez began his morning routine with the same quiet efficiency that characterized all his work. He unlocked the supply closet, arranged his cleaning materials, and started his systematic progression through the building's many floors. The difference on this Wednesday was the increased activity level among the regular staff, who seemed unusually focused on creating perfect impressions. Colonel Winters arrived at precisely 9 o'clock, accompanied by a small team of military personnel who would assist with her evaluation process. Her crisp uniform and confident bearing immediately commanded attention from everyone in the lobby. As she made her way toward the elevators, she noticed Henry methodically polishing the brass fixtures near the building's entrance. The elevator doors closed behind Colonel Winters and her team, but not before she had observed something that others routinely missed. Despite the building's obvious luxury and the expensive appearance of its furnishings, the true excellence lay in the meticulous attention to detail that someone clearly devoted to maintaining every surface, every fixture, and every corner to the highest possible standards. On the 20th floor, Jake's department had arranged themselves for maximum visibility. Rebecca Walsh had positioned herself strategically near the conference room, while several junior staff members lingered near their workstations, hoping to catch Colonel Winters' attention with displays of apparent productivity. Jake himself stood near his office door, reviewing documents that he hoped would demonstrate his importance to anyone who might notice. When Colonel Winters emerged from the elevator, the transformation in the department's energy was immediate and obvious. Voices became more professional, postures straightened, and every employee suddenly appeared deeply engaged in critical work. The colonel's trained eye immediately recognized the artificial nature of this performance, but she maintained her composed expression as she was escorted toward the conference room. The morning's scheduled meetings proceeded according to plan, with each department head presenting carefully prepared overviews of their operations. Jake's presentation on marketing strategies was polished and confident, hitting all the expected points about market penetration, customer engagement, and revenue growth. Colonel Winters listened attentively, occasionally asking pointed questions that demonstrated her sharp understanding of business operations. During a break between meetings, Colonel Winters excused herself to conduct what she described as an informal walking tour of the facilities. Her real purpose was to observe the organization's culture when people believed they were not being evaluated. She had learned through years of military experience that true character reveals itself most clearly in unguarded moments. As she walked through the various departments, Colonel Winters noticed the subtle but telling interactions between different levels of staff. She observed how executives spoke to their assistants, how senior managers treated junior employees, and, most importantly, how everyone related to the building's support staff. The pattern she discovered was both predictable and disappointing. Henry was cleaning windows in the executive break room when Jake and Rebecca entered, continuing a conversation about weekend plans that quickly shifted to complaints about building maintenance. They spoke freely, assuming that the elderly janitor was either deaf or simply unworthy of consideration as they detailed their frustrations with cleaning schedules and their belief that the building's management needed to hire more competent staff. "Honestly," Rebecca said, loud enough for Henry to hear clearly, "I don't understand why they keep these people around when they're obviously past their prime. That old guy has been moving like a snail all week. Yesterday I counted the time it took him to mop the hallway outside my office, 12 minutes for a space that should take 3. Jake nodded enthusiastically, sensing an opportunity to build rapport with his colleague. "Maybe we should mention it to management during our review sessions with the colonel. I'm sure someone with military experience would understand the importance of efficiency and competence." Neither Jake nor Rebecca noticed Colonel Winters standing just outside the break room entrance, having arrived in time to hear their entire conversation. More importantly, they failed to observe her expression as she watched Henry's response to their cruel commentary. The elderly janitor simply continued his work with steady dignity, neither defending himself nor showing any sign of anger or resentment. Colonel Winters stepped into the break room with a smile that Jake and Rebecca interpreted as friendly interest in their conversation. "I couldn't help overhearing your discussion about operational efficiency," she said. "As you mentioned, military experience does provide certain perspectives on these matters. Perhaps you could help me understand what specific efficiency improvements you would recommend." Jake straightened immediately, recognizing this as the opportunity he had been hoping for all morning. "Well, Colonel, it's really about maintaining standards that reflect the company's professional image. When you have staff members who can't keep pace with operational demands, it creates bottlenecks that affect everyone's productivity." "That's an interesting point," Colonel Winters replied, her tone remaining neutral. "In your opinion, what qualifications should be required for maintenance staff in a building of this caliber?" Rebecca jumped into the conversation, eager to demonstrate her own insights. Physical capability is obviously important, but I think there's also a question of background and experience. Some people simply don't have the foundation necessary to understand what's expected in a professional environment like Sterling Corporate. As they spoke, Henry quietly finished cleaning the windows and began organizing his supplies. Colonel Winters watched his methodical approach, noting the careful attention he paid to every detail and the respectful way he moved around the three people who were discussing him as if he were not present. "That's fascinating," Colonel Winters said. "I wonder if either of you has taken the time to learn about the backgrounds and qualifications of the maintenance staff you're evaluating. Has anyone actually reviewed their experience or training?" Jake and Rebecca exchanged glances, suddenly realizing that they had no actual knowledge about Henry's background beyond their assumptions based on his current position. The question hung in the air as Henry completed his work and pushed his cart toward the door, pausing only to nod politely to the three people who had been discussing his supposed inadequacies. After Henry left the break room, Colonel Winters continued her conversation with Jake and Rebecca, but her focus had shifted to understanding their thought processes and leadership potential. Through carefully crafted questions, she explored their attitudes toward teamwork, respect for colleagues, and their understanding of what constitutes valuable contribution to an organization. Meanwhile, Henry continued his rounds through the building, unaware that his every interaction was being noted by Colonel Winters' observation team. They documented his careful attention to detail, his courteous treatment of everyone he encountered, and his quiet professionalism in situations where others might have responded with anger or defensiveness. During lunch, Colonel Winters visited the basement cafeteria where Henry ate his simple meal while reading his worn paperback book. She observed from a distance as he shared his table with a younger maintenance worker who seemed to be struggling with a personal problem. Henry listened patiently, offered quiet words of encouragement, and shared part of his lunch with someone who had forgotten to bring money for the vending machine. The contrast between Henry's natural leadership and compassion and the artificial corporate climbing she had witnessed upstairs was striking. Colonel Winters made detailed notes about the various behaviors she had observed, building a comprehensive picture of the organization's true culture and values. That afternoon brought an unexpected development. Sarah Chan, the junior analyst who had shown kindness to Henry in the elevator, requested a private meeting with Colonel Winters. During their conversation, Sarah expressed concerns about the workplace culture she had observed since joining Sterling Corporate. "I've noticed that there seems to be an accepted pattern of disrespecting certain staff members," Sarah explained. "Particularly the maintenance and security personnel. It makes me uncomfortable because these people work just as hard as anyone else, and they deserve basic courtesy and respect." Colonel Winters listened intently as Sarah described specific incidents she had witnessed, including the morning's conversation in the break room and numerous other examples of casual cruelty directed toward Henry and other support staff members. Sarah's courage in speaking up, despite her junior position, impressed the colonel significantly. "What would you recommend to address these issues?" Colonel Winters asked. "I think people need to understand that how we treat others reflects our character more than our position or salary," Sarah replied. "Some of the most impressive people I've known have been in humble jobs, and some of the least impressive have been in executive positions." As the day progressed, Colonel Winters began to form clear impressions about the various individuals she had observed. Her military training had taught her to look beyond surface appearances and job titles to identify true leadership potential and character. The patterns she was documenting would soon become the foundation for recommendations that would surprise everyone at Sterling Corporate. The stage was being set for revelations that would challenge every assumption about value, respect, and the true qualifications for leadership. Henry Martinez continued his work with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his entire career, unaware that his example was being carefully studied by someone who understood the difference between position and character. Thursday morning arrived with an unexpected announcement that rippled through the Sterling Corporate Tower like an electric current. Colonel Winters had requested that all staff members gather in the main auditorium for what was described as an important presentation about leadership, service, and organizational values. The mandatory nature of the assembly meant that everyone from senior executives to maintenance staff would be present in the same room. Jake Morrison spent extra time that morning selecting his most expensive tie and ensuring his appearance projected the executive image he had worked so hard to cultivate. He arrived at the auditorium early, strategically positioning himself in the front section where Colonel Winters would be sure to notice his attention and engagement. Rebecca Walsh chose a seat nearby, equally determined to make a lasting impression on the distinguished military officer. The auditorium filled steadily as employees from every department filed in, creating an unusual mixing of the building's normal social hierarchy. Senior executives occupied the front rows, middle management settled into the center sections, and support staff naturally gravitated toward the back of the room. Henry Martinez entered quietly, choosing an inconspicuous seat near the rear where he could listen without drawing attention to himself. Colonel Winters took the stage at exactly 10 o'clock, her commanding presence immediately focusing the attention of the assembled crowd. Behind her, a large screen displayed the seal of the United States Army, lending additional weight to her words before she had even begun speaking. "Today I want to talk to you about something that lies at the heart of every successful organization," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. "I want to discuss the difference between position and character, between authority and leadership, and between what we think we see and what actually matters in determining a person's true value." Jake leaned forward eagerly, confident that this presentation would reinforce his own leadership qualities and, perhaps, provide him with insights that would accelerate his career advancement. Throughout the auditorium, other ambitious employees showed similar attention, all hoping to gain favor with someone who clearly possessed significant influence and connections. "Throughout my military career," Colonel Winters continued, "I have learned that the most important measure of any organization is how it treats its most vulnerable members. Not how it celebrates its stars or rewards its high performers, but how it demonstrates respect and appreciation for those who serve without recognition or glory." A subtle shift in energy moved through the auditorium as people began to sense that this presentation might not follow the expected pattern of corporate motivation and success strategies. Colonel Winters' words carried an undertone that suggested deeper evaluation and possible criticism of current practices. "Over the past 2 days, I have observed interactions throughout this building that have both impressed and concerned me," the colonel stated. "I have seen examples of genuine leadership and character, but I have also witnessed behavior that falls far short of the standards any organization should accept from its personnel." The room grew noticeably quieter as employees began to wonder whether they had been observed during moments they believed were private or unimportant. Jake felt a sudden flutter of uncertainty as he recalled various conversations and interactions from recent days, trying to remember whether he had said or done anything that might be interpreted negatively. Colonel Winters clicked a remote control, and the screen behind her changed to display a series of photographs taken throughout the building during her visit. The images showed various employees engaged in their daily routines, but they had been selected to illustrate specific points about workplace behavior and character. "Leadership is not defined by job titles or salary levels," she explained, gesturing toward a photograph that showed Henry carefully helping an elderly visitor navigate the building's entrance. "True leadership reveals itself through actions that demonstrate respect, compassion, and commitment to serving others, even when no one is watching or keeping score." The photograph clearly showed Henry's gentle assistance to someone who had been struggling with heavy packages and an unfamiliar building layout. Several employees in the auditorium recognized the scene, but most had walked past without noticing the interaction or considering its significance. Conversely, Colonel Winters continued, "Positions of authority can sometimes mask character deficiencies that become apparent only when we observe how people treat those they perceive as having less power or status." The next image showed Jake and Rebecca in the break room, their body language clearly indicating animated conversation while Henry worked quietly in the background. The photograph had been taken at the moment when their discussion of his supposed incompetence was most animated, capturing their expressions and gestures in ways that revealed their attitudes unmistakably. Jake felt his stomach drop as he realized that their private conversation had been observed and documented. Around the auditorium, other employees began to shift uncomfortably as they recognized scenes from their own recent interactions and wondered what conclusions had been drawn about their behavior. "What you're seeing here," Colonel Winters said, "represents a fundamental failure of leadership that undermines the entire organization's effectiveness and morale. When staff members are comfortable expressing contempt for their colleagues, when hierarchy becomes an excuse for cruelty, and when basic human respect is abandoned in favor of perceived superiority, the organization has lost its way. The colonel's words carried the weight of absolute moral authority, and Jake found himself unable to meet her gaze as she continued her presentation. Rebecca had gone pale, realizing that her casual cruelty had been witnessed by someone whose opinion could significantly impact her career prospects. However, Colonel Winters said, her tone shifting slightly, I have also witnessed examples of excellence that give me hope for this organization's future. I have seen individuals who demonstrate genuine leadership through their actions, their integrity, and their commitment to treating every person with dignity and respect. The screen changed again to show Sarah Chen holding an elevator door for Henry, their friendly conversation captured in a moment that radiated mutual respect and basic human decency. Another image showed Henry sharing his lunch with a coworker, his natural generosity evident in the simple act of caring for someone in need. These examples remind us that character is not determined by position, education, or economic status, Colonel Winters explained. Character is revealed through choices made when we think no one important is watching, through how we treat people who cannot advance our careers, and through the consistency of our values under both favorable and challenging circumstances. As the presentation continued, Colonel Winters began to weave together her observations into a comprehensive analysis of the organization's culture and leadership potential. She discussed specific behaviors she had witnessed, though she carefully avoided naming individuals directly. However, her descriptions were detailed enough that people throughout the auditorium could identify themselves and their colleagues in her examples. True service, she said, is not about advancing personal agendas or climbing organizational ladders. True service is about contributing to something larger than yourself, about making the lives of others better through your actions, and about maintaining your principles even when no one is applauding your efforts. Henry listened from his seat in the back of the auditorium, touched by the colonel's words but still unaware that his own example had become central to her presentation. He had always believed in treating others with respect and dignity, not because he expected recognition, but because his values demanded nothing less. Colonel Winters paused in her presentation, allowing her words to settle over the assembled employees before continuing. The silence in the auditorium was complete, broken only by the occasional shuffle of someone shifting uncomfortably in their seat or the soft whisper of clothing as people turned to glance at colleagues they recognized in the colonel's descriptions. Now, Colonel Winters said, I want to share something with you that will illustrate my point about the difference between what we see and what actually matters. I want to tell you about someone who embodies the very best qualities of service, leadership, and character. Someone who has been serving this organization with distinction for 15 years, but whose true background and qualifications have been overlooked by nearly everyone in this building. The tension in the auditorium became palpable as employees realized that Colonel Winters was about to reveal specific information about someone they all knew. Jake found himself hoping desperately that she would identify him as an example of positive leadership, though her earlier comments had made that seem increasingly unlikely. The individual I'm referring to, Colonel Winters continued, has served his country with exceptional honor and distinction. He has demonstrated courage under fire, leadership in impossible circumstances, and dedication to principles that never wavered despite facing challenges that would break lesser people. As she spoke, Colonel Winters began walking slowly across the stage, her eyes scanning the auditorium as if looking for someone specific. The employees in the front rows turned slightly, following her gaze toward the back of the room, though they had no idea whom she might be seeking. This person's service record includes multiple commendations for bravery, leadership awards for exceptional performance under pressure, and the respect of colleagues who served alongside him in some of the most difficult conditions imaginable. His character has been tested in ways that most of us can barely comprehend, and he has never failed to meet the highest standards of integrity and service. The auditorium was now completely silent, every person straining to understand where this revelation was leading. Colonel Winters stopped walking and turned to face the assembled employees directly, her expression serious and determined. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, I want you to meet someone who exemplifies everything I have been talking about today. Someone whose example of service, character, and dignity should inspire every person in this organization to examine their own behavior and commitments. She raised her hand and pointed directly toward the back of the auditorium, where Henry Martinez sat quietly in his simple gray uniform, his weathered hands folded carefully in his lap. Every head in the room turned to follow her gesture, confusion and disbelief spreading across hundreds of faces as they tried to understand why the distinguished colonel was singling out the elderly janitor. The auditorium fell into a silence so profound that the sound of ventilation systems seemed thunderous in comparison. Every eye in the room focused on Henry Martinez, who sat motionless in his back row seat, his face showing surprise and confusion as he realized he had become the center of attention. Jake Morrison felt his world tilting as he tried to process what was happening, while Rebecca Walsh gripped her chair arms so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Colonel Winters maintained her pointed gesture toward Henry, allowing the moment to stretch until the weight of anticipation became almost unbearable. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of absolute truth. "Stand up, please, Sergeant Major Martinez," she commanded, using a tone that was both respectful and unmistakably military. Henry rose slowly from his seat, his movements carrying a sudden dignity that seemed to transform him before everyone's eyes. As he stood at attention, something fundamental shifted in his posture and bearing. The elderly janitor disappeared, replaced by a soldier whose years of military discipline were evident in every line of his body. Sergeant Major Henry Martinez, Colonel Winters announced to the stunned auditorium, served with extraordinary distinction in the United States Army for 28 years. His service included 3 tours in combat zones, where he earned the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and the Army Commendation Medal with Valor. He led men in situations where failure meant death, and he never lost a single soldier under his command. The words hit Jake like physical blows, each detail shattering his comfortable assumptions about the man he had dismissed as incompetent and worthless. Around the auditorium, similar realizations were dawning on dozens of other employees who had treated Henry with casual contempt or complete indifference. Colonel Winters continued, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space. Sergeant Major Martinez's military occupational specialty was logistics and operations management. He was responsible for coordinating complex supply chains that kept entire battalions operational in hostile territory. His attention to detail, organizational skills, and ability to maintain peak performance under extreme pressure made him one of the most respected non-commissioned officers in his unit. Henry remained standing, his weathered face showing no emotion as his military history was revealed to people who had spent years seeing him as nothing more than an obstacle to their daily routines. The transformation was remarkable. The humble janitor was gone, replaced by a career soldier whose quiet dignity commanded instant respect. After his retirement from active duty, Colonel Winters explained, Sergeant Major Martinez chose to continue serving his community in civilian capacity. He moved here to be closer to his daughter and grandchildren, taking a position that would allow him to contribute meaningfully while spending time with his family. His choice to work in building maintenance was motivated by service, not necessity. Sarah Chen felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she understood the magnitude of what had been hidden in plain sight. She had sensed something special about Henry during their brief conversations, but she had never imagined the depth of experience and character that lay beneath his humble exterior. The code name I mentioned in today's announcement, Colonel Winters said, was Phoenix, the designation given to Sergeant Major Martinez during his final deployment. It was chosen because of his remarkable ability to bring order from chaos, to create success from impossible circumstances, and to maintain hope and determination when others had given up. Jake felt physically ill as he recalled the countless times he had spoken dismissively to or about the man now revealed as a decorated war hero. Every cruel comment, every impatient gesture, every moment of casual disrespect now seemed not just wrong, but personally shameful in ways that cut to his core. Colonel Winters gestured for Henry to approach the stage, and he moved forward with the measured pace of someone accustomed to military ceremony. As he walked down the auditorium's center aisle, employees on both sides turned to watch him pass, seeing him with completely transformed understanding. When Henry reached the stage, Colonel Winters extended her hand in a gesture of respect that carried profound meaning for anyone familiar with military protocol. They shook hands firmly, and, for a moment, 2 soldiers acknowledged their shared bond of service and sacrifice. Sergeant Major, Colonel Winters said, would you be willing to share a few words with these people about service and character? Henry accepted the microphone with steady hands, though it was clear that public speaking was not something he particularly enjoyed. When he began to speak, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard. I've never sought recognition for my service, he said simply. Military service taught me that the most important work is often the work that nobody notices. Whether you're maintaining equipment in a war zone or keeping a building clean in peacetime, the mission is the same: serving something larger than yourself with integrity and dedication. He paused, his eyes scanning the faces of people who had treated him with contempt for years. There was no anger in his expression, only the patient wisdom of someone who understood human nature in all its complexity. I've watched many of you over the years, Henry continued, and I've seen both kindness and cruelty, respect and dismissal, character and its absence. What I've learned is that how we treat people when we think it doesn't matter reveals who we really are. Every interaction is an opportunity to demonstrate our values or compromise them. Rebecca Walsh wanted to disappear entirely, remembering her harsh words about Henry needing to be in a retirement home. The man standing on the stage with quiet dignity was someone who had served his country with honor while she had been learning to walk, yet she had presumed to judge his worth based on his appearance and current job. "The young lady who has consistently shown me courtesy and respect," Henry said, nodding toward Sarah, demonstrated more leadership in those simple gestures than many people show in entire careers. Character isn't about position or power, it's about choosing to do what's right even when nobody important is watching. Colonel Winters resumed her position at the microphone as Henry returned to his seat, but the dynamic in the auditorium had been permanently altered. The comfortable hierarchies that had defined workplace relationships for years had been exposed as artificial constructions that obscured rather than revealed true worth and character. "The lesson I want you to take from today," Colonel Winters said, "is that every person deserves your respect until they prove otherwise through their actions." Sergeant Major Martinez earned that respect through decades of service and sacrifice, but even if he hadn't, he would still deserve basic human dignity simply by virtue of being a fellow human being. She clicked her remote control, and the screen behind her displayed a final image, a photograph of Henry carefully tending to a small garden behind the building that most employees didn't even know existed. In his free time, he had created and maintained a space of beauty for everyone to enjoy, asking for nothing in return except the satisfaction of contributing something positive to his workplace. True leadership, Colonel Winters concluded, is about making the lives of others better through your actions, maintaining your principles under all circumstances, and recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of every person you encounter. Some of you have demonstrated these qualities during my observation period. Others have revealed character deficiencies that require serious examination and change. As the presentation ended and employees began filing out of the auditorium, the building's social dynamics had been fundamentally transformed. Jake Morrison found himself unable to move from his seat, overwhelmed by shame and the realization that his behavior had been not just wrong but personally degrading to his own character. Sarah Chen approached Henry as he prepared to leave, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "I'm sorry that people treated you the way they did, and I'm sorry that your service went unrecognized for so long." Henry smiled gently, his weathered face showing no trace of bitterness or resentment. "Thank you, miss, but there's nothing to apologize for. You treated me with kindness from the beginning, and that meant more to me than you'll ever know. Character reveals itself in small moments, and yours has always been evident." Over the following weeks, the atmosphere at Sterling Corporate underwent a gradual but profound transformation. Some employees, like Jake and Rebecca, struggled to come to terms with their behavior and began making genuine efforts to change their attitudes and actions. Others, inspired by Henry's example and Colonel Winters' words, started looking for ways to demonstrate leadership through service rather than self-promotion. Henry continued his work with the same quiet dignity he had always shown, but now his colleagues understood the depth of character and experience that informed his approach to every task. His military background became a source of inspiration rather than hidden history, and his example influenced countless daily interactions throughout the building. The elderly janitor had taught an entire organization about the true meaning of service, respect, and character, not through speeches or presentations, but through 15 years of consistent example that had finally been recognized by someone with the wisdom and authority to reveal its true significance. In doing so, he had transformed not only how others saw him, but how they understood themselves and their responsibilities to treat every person with the dignity that human worth demands.